You are listening to When Therapists Watch TV, where we discuss today's buzzworthy TV shows and what they can teach us about ourselves, our relationships, and the world around us. I'm your host, Dr. Terri Bly, licensed clinical psychologist at LE Mental Health. So today I'm pivoting back to Ted Lasso. I know I've done a bunch of episodes about Ted Lasso already, but with season 3, we're starting to see some of the dynamics play out between Ted and Michelle with their divorce and co-parenting and dating after divorce. And even with Ted, like on Ted's side, we're seeing like his attempts to start thinking about dating with Sassy and what's happening there. And then with Michelle, we're seeing what's happening now as she starts dating again and some of the things that that brings up for them. And then we're also starting to see some co-parenting dynamics show up, some things that they're doing to co-parent their son, who starts to also encounter some issues in this season. And so because there's so much, and we're only halfway through the season as of the airing of this podcast, we're only 4 or 5 episodes in, but there's already been so much material that they've started to touch on that I really wanted to dig a little deeper into topics like co-parenting after divorce and dating after divorce, using these as examples, but really I really want to focus on just what can all of us learn about how to do this post-divorce dating thing and co-parenting and all of that. So there's a lot of good information here that we're going to be sharing with you. So I hope you'll stick around. To do this, I brought, again, Deb Link, who was here for an earlier episode about relationships. I'll let you introduce yourself again. I'm very excited to have Deb here because no one I've ever met knows more about divorce dynamics and co-parenting than Deb. So thank you for coming back again, Deb.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And remind us again who you are for those who did not see the last episode that you were in.
So I am Deb, and I work with families that are going through co-parenting, divorce, all those types of things, from low conflict to very high conflict. Mm-hmm. So I work as a therapist, a family therapist, or an individual therapist with various different folks in the family system. And then I also work as a parenting consultant or parenting coordinator, custody evaluator. I do a little bit of expert testimony. So that family court world is sort of my world.
So you've seen a lot of this. You've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. You've seen what works. You've seen what does not work. You've seen what ends up being best for the kids. And I imagine you've seen what
absolutely
really
does not serve their best interests. Yes.
And for full disclosure, for people who don't know, like I also do a lot of work with divorce.
Yes, you do.
I have a lot of clients who are divorced women, moms. I've done quite a bit of work with teenagers whose parents are divorced or going through divorce. And that's how you and I got to know each other, is that we both have done a lot of work in this world, which is why I'm excited to have this opportunity to kind of share with the audience some of the stuff that this show is bringing up. Because we just don't see a lot of shows that bring this stuff up in such an, real life, accurate, non-overly dramatic kind of way. I think Rebecca and Rupert, to me, their divorce is what we tend to see played out more often. On television and in the media, these more dramatic, like we're just going to keep torturing each other till death do us part.
Right.
But here we have what people refer to as an amicable divorce.
Right.
Which I think a lot of us tend to think of as kind of the gold standard. Like we want to get to, we want to have an amicable divorce.
Right.
And I think it also starts to point to like an amicable divorce isn't just, that doesn't make it an easy divorce.
Right. And it's not perfect.
And it's not perfect.
Right.
And it can still hurt a lot, just in different ways than torturing each other.
Yes.
So I know you have a lot of thoughts about season 3 so far. Where should we start? Where do you want to start?
Oh goodness. Well, we can start with Ted and Michelle. We could start with Henry.
Let's start with Ted and Michelle. Okay. So spoiler alert, Michelle starts dating. Let's start with what they call in business the low-hanging fruit. So Michelle starts dating
what would that be?
The couples therapist that met with them a few times. Right. So let's clear some air. I like to let people know a few things about what's in TV they might touch on, but really I think people need to understand a few things about that.
Yes.
Because it does happen.
Oh, it absolutely happens. I've been aware of several like real life situations where it's happened, absolutely. And and even though it may happen, it's not ethical and it's not good.
Right.
Right. Like it doesn't serve, you know, when you're doing relational therapy, your, I guess, obligation, your responsibility is to all of the family members. And there's just no way that you can be Ted in this situation and not have 1,000 feelings and 1,000 questions, right? And also not sort of rewrite the narrative of the entire therapy process. And so, you know, as therapists, we are responsible to protect the integrity of that process forever, not just while it's going on, right? And so there's just no way that you're Ted and you don't go back and like all of a sudden see certain comments differently and see certain parts of it differently. Like it's
like did he intentionally sabotage our couples therapy?
Absolutely.
Is where I would go if I were Ted. It'd be like, wait, did this not work because he didn't want it to work?
Right. Yeah. Or you know, like even if that's, you know, not true, like maybe it's just not what was happening, but it does at the very least raise the question of bias. Like if there was such a chemistry between these two, how did we have a fair process then, right? So so the therapist needs to protect that process, and this therapist didn't, and it's all too common.
Yeah, it really is.
And it just isn't something that should be going on. So I think that's good for the viewers to know, right? Like if you're in that situation, then, you know, that is unethical, and there are, you know, there is accountability for those types of things with therapists who have licensures and that sort of thing, because this isn't how it's supposed to go.
Correct. It's like you're not just limited to being upset or hurt. You actually can take action in this case because in any case, whether it's couples therapist, an individual therapist, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you start dating a client within, 2 years? After that therapy is terminated, it is a violation.
Absolutely.
And you can have your license removed and not practice.
Well, and I think it's a different number of years for different licensures, right? So even in Minnesota, we have LP, we have LICSW. I think some of them have their own rules around this particular issue. And then from state to state, different jurisdictions. And so I don't know.
Check.
Yeah, so check like what it is in your jurisdiction.
But all of them have rules around
All of them have some sort of rule about this, and some of them are more stringent than others. You know, some say that you've got a couple years before you could have some sort of personal relationship with a client. But there are some that say, you know, there are certain types of work with clients where you should never have that type of relationship, depending on what work you did. So I think that, you know, that's worth mentioning, right? That sometimes as therapists, we just like, when we watch these things on the media and they're portrayed as if like nothing's going to happen about this.
And like, oh, well, what are you going to do?
Right. And that's not quite how this goes in real life.
In this case, there are things you can do. So what else so there's a lot more here though to Ted and Michelle. So when you're thinking about what we see so far in season 3, what does it bring up for you in terms of post-divorce dating?
So many things. So I think one of the places that I had kind of more of a visceral reaction to when I was watching was that she didn't tell Ted herself. And I always kind of guide my clients when the child is going to find out about this person, right? Now, and this is where it comes with also post-divorce boundaries, right? Because when you are not married to someone anymore, it's really none of their business who you sleep with, who you go out on dates with, who you're interested in, who you're talking to. That is now a boundary. That's not something that they need to know.
Correct.
When you start to talk about it with the child, I think it's wise to talk about it with your co-parent first, especially if the child is going to meet that person. Now, sometimes people ask me, should you offer a chance for the co-parent to meet the person before the child does? It's a nice gesture. Some co-parents aren't interested in it. They just don't, they're just not emotionally ready to meet your new person, or they trust you and they know like you're not going to pick somebody that's not safe, so they don't feel the need, right? But at least they need to know about this person. I mean, and I say that because kids just in general talk about, we forget kids have one life, right? One life at two homes.
Yeah.
And they generally just talk about their life, much
they
like
don't know
we do.
what's normal or what's unusual or what
Right.
they don't know how their parents are going to react. Yeah, like you said, they're just living their life,
Right.
and talking about it.
Exactly. Like, like if you have a spouse, your spouse probably is familiar-ish with the first names of some of the people that you work closest with, right? Because that's just, you just use them in conversation. So kids just use these names in conversation, just like Henry did with Ted on the video call. And you have this moment where Ted's face changes, right? And kids are so in tune to those face changes. They're hyper vigilant to what's going on with mom and dad's face and what it means.
Especially, and more so after divorce, because they know
absolutely.
that things are heightened. They know that there's stuff between mom and dad, and so they are even more in tune to their parents' reactions when they're talking about the other parent.
Of course. And I loved the subtlety of the look that crossed Ted's face and how quickly it crossed his face, because that's maybe best case scenario.
Yeah.
Like that's right. Like that's maybe like 5% of like real divorced humans, right? Would have that quick of a reaction and recover and move on, focused on Henry, right? But even with that small of a reaction, Henry now knows that his dad did not have that piece of information. You can tell the surprise, right? And so then he knows that his parents aren't talking about like big stuff, like the fact that this person exists in his life now. Some kids also start to feel immediately guilty. Like maybe I wasn't supposed to say that. Like if mom didn't say it, was it a secret?
Right. Was it a secret? Yeah.
And we don't ever want kids in a divorce situation to be wondering what information is a secret. And so I always,
we don't want kids feeling like they need to keep secrets.
Keep any secrets
from their parents.
Exactly. And so I always talk with folks about how, wait until you have the kid for a few day stretch. At the beginning of your stretch, send over a message to the other parent and say, hey, just wanted to let you know I'm dating. I've mentioned the name a couple times to our child. If you hear the name Susie, Tommy, Bob, Bud, whatever, that's who that is. Give that parent a few days while you've got the kid to kind of get used to this. And then you've decreased the likelihood that when your kid happens to mention this person in passing conversation, that your co-parent has a reaction in front of the kid. They've had their reaction in private.
On their own time,
Maybe. Right now, some co-parents are just not going to be effective with this no matter what, and there's nothing you could have done about it. And you can increase the odds that the kid doesn't have that awkward intervention or awkward, situation if you just communicate it,
I want to just go back just a little bit to the, meeting, if the ex can meet the current partner first. I do think there's something to be said for that.
Sure.
But when I talk to clients about this, I say, even if it doesn't happen, I like to view it as, I guess, a test, if you will, of the person you're dating. If the new person you're dating isn't willing to meet your ex, even if the meeting doesn't happen, if they're like, no, I don't want to meet your ex, to me, that's a red flag that maybe you should be rethinking who you're dating. Because the ex, we talk a lot about like the kind of the joke throughout the generations is you don't just marry that person, you marry their mother. For me, when you're divorced, you're kind of marrying their ex. But when there are kids involved, like that person is not someone you can pretend doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
And so if you're not willing to meet them, if you're not willing to acknowledge that they are going to be a part of this life, then you're probably not ready to be in a relationship with a divorced person who has a kid.
Has children. Absolutely.
And so to me, that's even a bigger deal than, your ex meeting your partner, is your partner being willing to at least consider meeting your ex as part of this. So that's something that I think is actually really important, because when what we see is when the ex or when the new partner isn't willing to talk to or look at or acknowledge the former partner, that just makes things so much more complicated for the kids.
Yeah. And it's also a red flag. That level of jealousy and insecurity is a red flag about that person's, their own healing process from whatever caused that level of jealousy and uncertainty, right? Because this is a person who's coming, they have a kid, they've had a previous partner, obviously. And that can't be, big earth-shattering news. Yeah.
So when it comes to so I'm sure you get this question easily as often as I do, is how soon do you think someone should be or how long does somebody date before introducing the kid to the partner? What do you think is I realize it's going to be, case by case, but do you have general guidelines, or are there ways a person can kind of cues, or I don't know, what do you use to guide people in that decision?
Sure. I would say that I don't know if there's, research behind it, but I would say the number I see most often is 6 months.
6 months is kind of the rule of thumb.
Yeah, yeah. And like, I think that sort of speaks to like, logistically, when your life has become so tied to someone, like if you've been dating them for 6 months exclusively, right, your life is pretty tied to them. And it becomes sort of logistically difficult to have your life tied to someone and not have your kid tied to them. Also, I do understand a lot of parents say, if I'm going to think about some sort of permanency with this person, I would like to know sooner rather than later if they have good chemistry with my kid.
Sure.
Right? Like I could really like them, but I'm not interested in a long-term relationship with somebody that doesn't get along with my kid. So I'd sort of like to test that out a little bit. On the other hand, we don't want the kids to be introduced to all of these different people who are all sort of temporary.
Right.
That can be really jarring for them, right? That like adults kind of come and go, and this revolving door can, impact their view of, whether adults are stable and consistent and predictable in their life. So, you got to kind of find that like balance where this is a person that you're relatively certain there's some potential with, and you're still open to the idea that you could give that relationship up if the child isn't comfortable, like that sweet spot right there. Like that's really where we're trying to find,
What about talking about them? So I think this comes up more often, especially with teenagers. When clients of mine have teenagers, they can just sense something is up. They can see mom's facial expressions change with certain text messages versus others. And so let's say your teenagers are onto you, and they're like, okay, I see your face. That's my friend texting face. I know my girls did this with me. They were like, Mom, that smile. That's not a usual, my friend Greta just texted me smile, and they're like, what's going on? And so they knew. They figured that out real fast.
Yeah.
So what do you do then? Like, you're not ready to introduce them to who you're dating, but you also don't want to lie and gaslight your kids and be like, no, I'm just really excited to hear from this friend. You don't want to lie either.
Right.
Besides, my girls would know if I was lying. They just, they could just smell it. They'd be like, no, bullshit.
No. Yeah.
So how about when they suspect that maybe you're dating? Can you talk about the person? How much information do you give them if you've got teenagers, especially teenage girls who want to know all the details? Or,
Right. Well, so I think one of the things that I tell co-parents a lot is that, there's sort of like what's going on the surface, right? And then there's like a whole bigger thing that's going on. The bigger thing here is that you're teaching your daughters how to do this, right? Like how to do romantic relationships. And so I think it's great that they know that you have this person without maybe meeting him or her right away, because you're showing them like when you have a new relationship, you can be like head over heels excited about it enough to create this face and still not immediately integrate them into everything that's important in your life.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so like this is how I feel about this person.
This is my crush face.
This is my crush face, yes. And and I think it's great for them to know like this is, who this person is. Do they also have kids? Do they live close by? Is this where you've been flying on the weekends while we're with dad? Like those kinds of things. I think it's great to have those conversations with them. Because it helps them understand that healthy relationships exist in a gradual progression, and that's how theirs should, happen someday too, hopefully, right? So I think it's fine to talk about them.
So what if you have kids who, and this has happened with some of the clients I know too, what if you have kids who are like, I don't think you should be dating. I don't like this. I don't like that you're dating. You should be paying attention to us. You should be like we should be getting all of your attention.
Sure.
You've put us through enough already. Because again, we're talking about
Yes.
teenagers. You
Yes.
get that
Oh,
15
yes.
to 17-year-old.
Yes.
Again,
Oh,
a
goodness
lot of times
gracious.
it's girls
Yep.
who are full of opinions
Oh,
about
yeah.
what you should and shouldn't be
Yes,
doing.
they are.
So what do you
Yes.
do if your teenagers are kicking up, or younger kids, but what if
Sure.
they're kicking up a fuss about the idea of mom dating again or
Yes,
dad dating again?
Yeah. I mean, my like first word that I bring to parents, no matter what they're kicking up a fuss about, is validation, right? Like you start with, yeah, I hear this is really hard for you. I hear that you didn't choose for your family to change in these ways. You know, dad and I have had more to focus on, or mom and I and dad and I, you know, whatever family structure you have. The reality is that there's a nugget of truth in what kids are saying there, that, you know, when a family splits, they have to have almost double the amount of money. So parents are more focused on work, or working more hours, or sometimes working a job they never had before because they were a stay-at-home parent, right? They are going to their own therapy and attending their divorce support group, or, you know, and then they're also a lot of times starting to sort of reclaim parts of themselves that they felt kind of went dormant in the relationship. So they might be resurrecting girls' weekend or guys' fishing trip or whatever, right? And so all of a sudden the kids do sort of feel like, whoa, there was a lot of time for us in this nuclear family, and now the time and the money and all the different kinds of resources are split every which way.
My parents are not focused on me as maybe they were before.
Yes.
Why do I feel like mom or dad or both are devoting all this time and attention to things that aren't about me anymore?
Right. And so I think there's a way to say, like, you're not crazy. You're not making up that this is different. Like, our family structure is different. And the validation piece is, it's okay that that's hard for you and that you have feelings about it, you know? And I think that there can be sort of a subtle message of, like, adults make decisions about what's best for them, you know? Because kids, one of the things we look for are signs of something called like adultification or parentification, where a child in a divorce situation, like if you've got kind of the parents and the kids, right? The kids kind of eke their way up and they want to become a part of that parental relationship, right? And part of that is making adult decisions. And so I think it's okay to send the message like, okay, so whether or not I date is like a thing I'm going to decide, because that belongs up here and you're here, right? And I understand that you have lots of feelings because it impacts you. And I want you to feel like you can tell me those feelings, even if you think they're going to be hard for me to hear, or I'll be angry, or you're going to hurt my feelings if you say it. Like, how do you really feel about it? And I think there can be some problem solving that sort of moves away from where the conversation starts, which is, I am going to tell you what you should be doing. That's not how a parent-child relationship goes. To underneath that, I have an unmet need, and I didn't know how to say it, so I said this thing instead.
Okay.
Right? But what is that unmet need that the child has, and how can the parent just work to validate the child's experience and meet that need? That's your job in that conversation as a parent.
Because there is a reality that when you start dating again, I mean, I think a couple things that I notice, and maybe Michelle falls into this too, is like, when you start dating again, your judgment is just not great. Like, you're so into this new relationship, and you're in that crush phase that, like, all you want to do is be with that person, and so your energy, like your thoughts, your like so much of your energy goes into that new relationship, and I think you are at risk of deprioritizing your kids, maybe more than is reasonable, maybe more than so. I do think it's trying to find out, like, your kids are giving you feedback. They're trying to tell you shouldn't be dating at all. And maybe, I mean, as I'm thinking through this, maybe it is a good idea to say, okay, I'm still going to date. I get to do that.
Yes.
And maybe I check myself. Maybe I just do quick, like, some introspection. Maybe I talk with my therapist. Maybe I look at, is what they're complaining about actually that I'm just all in this new relationship because it feels good. And it's so nice to feel wanted again, and you know, having that need met that's maybe been unmet for a very long time.
Yeah.
So I do think there are pitfalls there that our judgment gets a little. Plus, I think our kids have seen us. When you're going through divorce, you're never your best self.
Right.
Like, you're not as present with your kids. You are in the midst of hell.
Yeah.
And so I think your kids kind of lose some confidence in you too when they see parents falling apart.
Yeah.
think that's when the
terrifying
parentification
for
starts to
kids.
happen, because
Yeah.
they're like, oh, my parents do not have their shit together.
Right. So, but I'm going to be the one who does.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that also, I mean, one of the things that we talked about in the relationship episode was this idea of differentiation, that you remain kind of your own person in a relationship, and yet your choices are impacted by the fact that you are partnered, and you need to consider the impact on that relationship, right? So this is once again a modeling opportunity for parents. If a child comes to them and says, you're not all the way here. Like when you're here, you're not here.
Yeah.
You know, you're somewhere else.
Yeah.
And you're not here, right? Very much. When they are expressing like those needs, they need to see the parent be differentiated about it, to say, okay, I am still going to be able to have relationships, because that's a thing that adults do. And it's a thing that when you become an adult, I want you to feel permission to do, right? And you should be able to see in my behavior, my tone of voice, my decisions, that this conversation impacted me. Not that it made all of my decisions for me, not that I just kind of gave my power over to you as my child, but that you have an impact or an influence on the types of decisions that I make that impact you.
So I hear you, and I'm going to take a look at this.
Yes.
I'm going to maybe see if there are things that I could be doing differently. I'm going to put my phone in a different room. I'm going to, we're going to do like girls' night, where or kids and mom and kid, we're going to spend some quality time, and we're going to have our phones away, and it's just going to be us. So something like that, where they're seeing, they know that you heard them, but you're not like, okay, I won't date anymore.
Right, because it's teaching them how to do relationships, that someday they're going to bring a concern about an unmet need to their partner or someone else, their college roommate or whatever in their life, right? And what they should expect of that conversation is that they don't get to control that person. And that person should be influenced or impacted at some level by the fact that they're negatively impacting, the child. And so that is healthy relationships, and you get to practice that. I mean, I think divorce brings up 102 different ways to practice these things with your kids and to show them like what it should look like, right? So I really encourage parents, one thing I want to mention about going all the way back to your original question, there are adult things that rise up inside of parents when they hear those sorts of things. And in this one, the most common one, which is also oftentimes accurate, is that this is not just a feeling the child is having, but it is a script from the other parent.
Oh,
your parent shouldn't be dating. Your mom shouldn't have. Your mom went out with her boyfriend on her parenting time. Right. Your dad had his girlfriend over and to sit on the couch and watch the movie instead of just spending time with you. Right? Like it's a script that
I think grandparents can give that message too. I hear that from grandparents. Even the dating parents will be like, will be coming down with some judgments on that.
Yes. And so sometimes the parent gets wrapped up in the adult level of it, right? Like the kid says this to them and they're like, well, do you really feel that way? And did dad tell you that? Did mom say that? What did they say? Who was there? Who was it said in front of? Like they go to this adult thing and they couldn't be more like misattuned emotionally to the child's experience. So I really teach parents like put that on the back burner, like put it somewhere.
Whether or not it's coming from the other parents.
Or the grandparents or whatever. Like all of that's adult stuff. Anytime that you've got the other parent in your head, you're on the adult level. Tune into the kid. Oh wow, you have felt like I haven't been as present since the divorce, or since I started dating Johnny, or since, whatever. So I think that
so even if you suspect that this is coming, that this is getting fueled by the other parent or grandparents, and your kid's coming to you and kind of echoing that stuff, you don't want to say, oh wait, is this your other parent who's
do you really feel this way, or is that just their feelings, right? Because the kid doesn't know. Like it's all just kind of jumbled up.
Kids aren't like, oh yeah, you're right, I don't actually feel this way.
Right. Let me sit here and parse out in my feelings what came from that comment from grandma, what is truly my own experience, and what came from dad's impression of it, right? Like they don't, that's just too sophisticated for them. And so that's a misattuned response.
And a missed opportunity to have those conversations about boundaries with your kids, and about like dating, and about like, I want to be here for you, and let's talk about how we can spend some time together. And, so I want us to pivot a little bit then to, well, actually, you mentioned earlier something about the 4 A's. Does that come in here? Or is that?
Sure. So
or is that how they handle stuff with Henry? Is that?
Well, so kind of both, right? So when you've got this new person, one of the questions is like, what is their role in this child's life? So we get a couple clues in Ted Lasso, right? That the new partner, Jake, has purchased a couple things for Henry, right? Like a couple toys that Henry talks about and plays with him, right? So we get a little bit of that, but we get this question of like, what should be this person's role? And so I love what my friend Lori over at the Bridging Center talks about, the quadruple A. And I think Erin Pash here talks about it too. So an authentic, available, affirming adult. Right? And so that is what your job is in this child's life, as the step parent, or whether you're married or not married, right? As that bonus, like I love when people call it a bonus parent, right? Because it's not a replacement for anyone, and it never should be and never will be. And it is this bonus, and it's somebody that can be exactly that. They can be an authentic human being who's available to that child, who can be a support to that child, can be their extra ride for those extracurriculars that they're really, involved in and that they love. And that is affirming of that child, like support. That's your role, right?
Kind of like an uncle or an aunt is how I look at it.
Yeah, like an auntie. It's not somebody who's going to discipline. It's not someone who's going to, set a bunch of structure. Like it's somebody who's just going to be present to that child. And one of the things that I really think is like missed in all of this, when we talk about like the trauma of divorce on kids and the impact it has, there's a lot of sort of bad news bears about like how divorce impacts
You're
kids.
just going to mess up the kids, end of story. There's no upside.
Right, and we know that when parents can be more like Ted and Michelle, where they're not in conflict, that's actually not true, right?
That the kids tend to be okay.
Right, they do.
When the parents are co-parenting well.
Yes, without conflict, exactly. And we know that there's other sort of auxiliary things that we can put in a kid's life that builds resilience, right? And one of those things is these quadruple A's, that the more adults that are not related to that child but take an interest in that child, right? Like coaches and teachers and neighbors and those types of people. When another adult kind of takes delight in you, takes an interest in you, shows support for you out of their own kind of free will choice, that is a powerful resilience builder in children. And we know that from the research. And so sometimes you see these families where there's a really amicable situation, both of them repartner, and all of a sudden you've got like two parents and two bonus adults for that kid, and it can be really beautiful, right? Or one on one side or the other.
More people to love your kid.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, there are some upsides that can benefit kids in these ways, but it takes step parents or, bonus parents in that role, whether the parents remarry or not, to stay in that lane as a quadruple A, right? And we get some clues that Jake is doing that, right? Like Jake is not on the phone with Ted. Jake is not sending the messages about the bullying situation that comes up. He's not doing the co-parental communication. He's not trying to discipline the kid. He's buying him cool toys and playing with him.
So despite being a hugely unethical therapist, he's kind of staying in his lane.
It appears to be so far staying in his lane. Yes.
Right.
As a step parent, way out of his lane as a professional. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so now pivoting to Ted, because Ted's struggling with Michelle dating, which is pretty common.
Of course, yes.
And I mean, it's understandable, it's human, it's really hard.
It is.
Especially if they start dating before you, whichever one starts dating first, it stings. It's kind of really marks the end. Like it makes this like real.
Yes, it does.
And a lot of people use this opportunity to kind of wig out. Make an issue out of it, bring it up of like, oh, he shouldn't be anywhere near my kid, and I'm gonna get a lawyer, and I'm gonna make it, blah, blah, blah. I'm gonna be angry. But how do you know when, and Ted does have concerns, how do you know when your concerns are legitimate? When do you, what do you do when you're the other parents? Like, do you have advice for people on like, I don't think this person should be around my kid. I don't like it. I don't think I don't approve of this. What do you do when that's how you're feeling?
Yeah. Well, I think first you have to acknowledge that ultimately at its core, divorce is a huge loss of control.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, that's fundamentally what it is. Now, at the same time, it's sort of a reclaiming control on parts of your life, right? There are things that now you get to decide for yourself that this other person doesn't get to influence anymore. And that's exciting on the one hand. But when you have kids, there's this whole, like, that whole other parenting time you have very little control or influence on, right? And so I think that, you know, if I would say one of the most common things that I work with parents on in that situation is the DBT skill, radical acceptance. Just like radically accepting, like, I don't get to control X, Y, or Z. There's now 50% or 40% or 60% or whatever amount of time that the kids spend with that other parent, that other parent gets to decide who are they exposed to, whose house are they taken to.
They get to decide what's best for the kid.
Yes, they do.
You might not like it.
And you might not like it. And if they cross certain lines, you might be able to do something about it, right? Like if they're exposing the child to drugs, or you know, your kid's tested positive for marijuana because they're in a hot garage, like, okay, then we might be able to do something about it, right?
But the bar's pretty high.
The bar's really high, right? And this is so difficult for parents because all parents want the very best for their kids, right? They want
they have their own values and what they think that looks like.
And they want their kid they want to transfer those values to their kid. That is like what parents want to do. And when they lose control of that part of the time, it's really difficult. So I really try to start with, have you really worked on your own radical acceptance about the things you literally don't get to have control of anymore? Have you identified an actual harm to the child of this particular thing, right? You know, is the new partner treating the child in a way that the child comes home crying, or like, is there some kind of impact on the child, or do you just not like it? Right? Like,
you just disagree with some of it, or it makes you feel uncomfortable, or
it's different than your parenting style, right? Like that kind of thing. And so I think, you know, parents have to kind of understand that they don't get to litigate the other person to be in compliance with their parenting style and their value system. The other person gets to have their own parenting style and their own value system. Where sometimes litigation can be effective is when there's been harm or that kind of thing. But there's a lot of acceptance that has to happen. And I think this is a good time for personal therapy to kind of sort out, what is just my own personal feelings about the fact that this person moved on, that they moved on first, that they moved on at all. What if that is my own emotional healing, and what if that actually impacts my kids? And I also think most parents miss the cost-benefit analysis that, you know, maybe there is sort of a negative impact of something going on in the other home, okay? Because let's be honest, all of us as parents negatively impact our kids at some point, right? So maybe that's real. Is the child going to be more negatively impacted by that kind of being an ongoing dynamic, or by parental conflict in court over
making a big deal out of it?
Yes, and most of the time the answer is court's going to be worse.
It's the conflict between the parents that almost always creates.
So I do a lot of talking with the parent about, how do you, I call it like the addition problem instead of the subtraction problem. How do you take opportunities to let your value system sit alongside of the other parent's value system? So if the message is, a common one is the dad tells the kid that if they are bullied at school, they can beat the crap out of that kid and it's self-defense and that's okay. And the mom is like, he just gave my kid permission to hit somebody, right? That's one I've heard many times. So like, how does the mom instill her value system inside the child to sit alongside of dad's value system, not as a subtraction problem, but as an addition problem, to say like, there's a couple different ways to look at this, right? And I think that that's helpful, that parents can claim appropriate power. As a parent, they do have the ability to share their own value system with their child. Where we start to get into a problem is when they try to cancel out the other parents.
Other parents' value system is wrong.
Right.
This is the right way. I can't believe they said that to you.
Right.
Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly where we start to get into the issues, because then the kid is placed in this instant loyalty bind, trying to figure out which of their parents is a better parent and has better perspectives and healthier choices, and now everything's a competition between like, does dad have the real truth about this, or do I have the real truth about this, or mom, or whatever. So we don't want to place the kid in that situation. And kind of going back to what I said earlier about life skills, we do want to teach the kids relational life skills through the divorce process, and this is one of them. The ability to identify two different ways to see something and to see the pros and cons in each of those ways, and then eventually to find their own way through where they kind of figure out which one they align with a little bit more and why.
Pick kind of their own, they start to cobble together their own value system and their own way of being in the world.
Yes. And they have the space to do that if they're not being told by one side or the other or both that this one is wrong and this one is right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about Ted, and I want to talk about his process, because the other thing, so we can talk about like, when should the kids meet the other partner and, all of that stuff. But if we kind of backtrack from there, Ted's at a different place. Michelle is dating.
Yes.
Ted's at a different place in this.
Yes.
And actually, one thing though that I wanted to mention is when you mentioned the control thing about divorce and that loss of control, I do wonder if that's what the panic attacks are about, is all of these things that Ted can't control, and seeing what's happening with his kid.
Yes.
And he's not there, and the dating and all of this, like he's losing control over so much of his life. Distance being part of that, but also, but anyway, so I think they do a nice job illustrating that. Like I'm losing control of so many things I care so deeply about, and it's terrifying. So Ted is at a different place. He didn't want this divorce.
Yeah.
He still very much loves Michelle.
Yes.
He still wants them to be a family. He does not like this whole like two-family idea at all, and that's really clear. And he even says as much. Like I want us to be a family, and I love you still. And so he's not anywhere at that making peace with this.
Yeah.
So, and he tries to date, he kind of explores dating Sassy a little bit. So they're kind of friends with benefits now, and he tiptoes into what if we were more, and she's like, you're a hot mess, no. And he was a little surprised, apparently, to hear that. So what are your thoughts on whether it's dating or not, just like having some, flings, how does somebody, is there a right way to go about emerging from being a hot mess? And when do you know when you're not because we're all a mess. Like we all have our stuff, especially I think when you've been through divorce, you're going to have your relational trauma and all of that and whatnot. But how do you navigate that? You still want contact, you still want to date. Like I think it's still okay to do some of that, but like how do you navigate the messiness of post-divorce, trying to find your way and stumble around?
Yeah. Well, I think that we see some pieces with Ted that are good, right? So Ted, despite how difficult it is for him to be vulnerable, is still in therapy, right? Like he continues to talk with Dr. Sharon. He also, we see some progress, right? So Ted is conflict avoidant, right? And he preserves peace in his relationships by not saying the things, right? And we see this going on in ways that are really effective for him, like the elevator scene with Nate.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, where there's a lot of things that Ted could have said, and not saying all of those things keeps Ted actually in the position of power in that relationship, right? So there are times where everybody around him is like, fight it.
Yeah.
And he makes a wise choice not to, right? And we see that with Nate. But there are also times where it's less healthy for him to kind of bury his voice and his own assertiveness and agency. And I think he did that a lot with Michelle, right? Through this whole divorce process, it's kind of been whatever Michelle wants, right? He hasn't been able to stand up to Michelle, right? And so, but he does. In one of these episodes where he says, I just need to say this out loud. This, I don't feel okay with you dating our marriage therapist. And I love that scene because his intention there is literally just to be heard and to respect himself enough to say his truth out loud. He's not asking for her to break up with him. He doesn't say that.
He's not demanding that she break up with him. He's not threatening anything. He's not making it about the kid.
No.
He's saying this, I don't like this.
Yes. And because it's not coercive, it's just, I'm going to start building a co-parenting relationship with you where I get to say my truth and you get to say yours, and then it's that addition problem. They get to sit alongside of each other. But mine's not going to be missing anymore, Michelle.
Yeah.
Right? Like he's like, so we see like this health kind of like emerging. We also see, him take the question, am I a mess, to the Diamond Dogs again, which I talked about last time. I think that's a healthy sign, right? That he's willing to get feedback about this question from people that he trusts. So I think Ted is a work in progress, as most people after divorce are. I think he's doing all the right things to get to the place where he might be more ready for a relationship. And I don't know, I kind of have to agree with Sassy. I don't think he's there yet. He's still too like immersed in the relationship. He hasn't healed enough from Michelle. Like there's a piece there that still needs to happen.
Yeah,
right?
I wouldn't date Ted at this stage.
No.
Like you are geared, like he's still very much, he doesn't just love Michelle, he's still in love with her, you get the sense. Like he's very much attached still. He
hasn't grieved, like he's not at the end of the grieving process, right? And so I think that divorce is a grieving process, right? And there's many stages of grief, much like when someone dies, and he's not at that closure acceptance stage. And I think that for a true kind of partnership relationship, you're going to have to get to that closure stage, right? And he's not there. Now, can you experiment with human connection through that time? Different people have different opinions about that. I think it depends on the person. I think some people have kind of this chronic relational dependence that they need to sort of get sober from, and just having a period of not dating would be good for that person, right? Then you have people that are pretty independent, but they were married for 35 years to this person. They have no idea, like, what's my style now? And just going on some casual dates and getting to know some people, and it might be really good and exploratory, like a very good learning process about who they are now, right? So, I mean, I think it's hard during that healing stage. One thing I think is important is just, openness and consent, right? Like letting people know, what are you looking for? Are you in that stage where you're looking for something serious and you're ready? Or is this a casual thing for you because it's somewhat about your own self-exploration? I think as long as you're upfront and forward with people and there's kind of a mutual consent for whatever it is that you're looking for, it can be fine to kind of have some human connection through that process. What we don't want is for someone to dive into that really, heavy relationship before they're ready for that.
Don't you think, though, that even if you've done your therapy and you haven't dated for a while, I almost feel like it's really hard to know what your issues are going to be until you start dating.
Some of the mess comes out when you're actually like in the moment, right? Like,
because sometimes I feel like there's this myth that like, well, you do your therapy and you don't date for some period of time, 6 months, 12 months, whatever, and then you're going to do relationships and you're in a healthy place. And so, but I think there is a piece that you can't really work through in therapy or on your own until you start doing until you start doing the relational thing again. And then some of those final wounds start to show, and you start to experience some of the stuff that you really couldn't come face to face with until you try a relationship again.
Yes.
So I do think that it's important for people to understand that sometimes you do need to like practice dating a little bit to really understand what your work is. You can't just do all of it single, I don't think.
I don't think you can either. I mean, I think that these wounds were created relationally, so they will be triggered relationally and healed relationally. That's really what I believe. Like the relational context is the context for the hurt, for the insight, and for the healing. And so, yes, I think people being in relationships, I mean, we see this with, folks who have like family of origin trauma, and they do some therapy around it. They get a lot of, health and healing around certain parts of it. They get married thinking, I healed my family of origin trauma. And then 10 years into the relationship has revealed and unearthed like a different portion of their family of origin trauma. And that's not because they didn't do a good enough job in therapy. It's because relationships bring up things that we can't bring up on our own. That's why we go to therapy.
That attachment stuff surfaces
in relationships.
In relationships.
Exactly. So I think you're absolutely right.
I also think it's hard to know, like, usually when I'm working with couples, I'll say, like, when they talk about the other person is doing that's problematic, I usually, you're probably right. People tend to have a pretty decent idea of what the other person is doing.
Sure. Yeah.
But they have a harder time seeing what they're doing.
Yes.
And I think it's you can work through the divorce stuff, you can start to understand how you contributed, but I also think it's hard to know what the patterns are in terms of how you contribute to relationship dynamics until you start to see them resurface with a new person.
Yes.
That you thought it was your ex that was the problem, and that they were doing this, and you just need to
Yes.
find someone who's not like this. And then you find someone who seems very much not like your ex.
Yes.
And yet, lo and
And
behold,
they have experienced you the same way.
yes, and suddenly you're seeing things.
Interesting.
Yeah, huh. So
Yeah.
I guess that is me.
Yeah.
Well, shit. Now I'm gonna have to deal with that. But I do think that dating after divorce can start to reveal,
Yes.
help give you some clues as to, oh, how did I contribute to my
Yes.
first marriage not working out? And
Yes.
and that's a painful thing. Like,
Yeah.
then you've got more work to do. And I think you can still stay in relationships. But I do think once you start to see that, that's another stage of grieving, is when you really start to, when you're in new relationships, and that's when you start to realize how you contributed to your first marriage not working out. And then you go through a whole new grieving process of, well, shit, that part was me.
Right.
Damn it, and I didn't see it.
Right.
So I just think, I do think dating, I tend to be kind of pro dating after divorce if you're willing to do the work, if you're willing to use it as an exercise in insight, in self-awareness, and not just like trying to distract yourself from pain, or like just get caught up in the kind of a love addiction to feel better about yourself. But as an exercise, it's like going into it with eyes wide open and almost a curiosity of, wow, what am I going to learn about myself in my relationships post-divorce?
And I think this is one of my biggest, crucibles that I think that you can put your new potential partner through, because if they've come out of serious relationships or their own divorces, they best be able to answer this question right here. How did they contribute? And if they
or at least be curious. Well, I'm still learning that.
Yes. So it's that curiosity, that teachability, that humility. But it's a red flag when you meet someone that is able to convince you that it's 100% their ex's fault and 0% their fault. That is not usually the case. So
and even if it is, that person's still paired up with that person.
And there's so the question there is, what's the vulnerability that was in me to that unhealthy of a relationship?
There's something to learn from every breakup, and if you're dating somebody who hasn't done that work, to me that's a sign that this is not someone who can do relationships. So
there's so many other things. Like I wanted to talk about Henry and there's so many pieces. The bullying thing. Like there's so many pieces of this particular. Just these 5 episodes have been so rich when it comes to so many moments.
I tell you what, because I'm in love with the show, and we're just gonna I'll just have to convince the people, the powers that be, that this show just warrants more attention. I think we should, once this, we've got a couple more episodes coming out, I think we should revisit. I think we should talk about Henry and co-parenting and see what else comes up.
Let's do it after we see the rest of the season, because I think it'd be really interesting to see because Henry is centered a little bit more in these episodes than he ever has before, and I want to see where that goes, because I have thoughts, but maybe we just need to tease out the rest of the plot line before we
I have a prediction that Ted's going to end up going back to the United States, so I'm going to make that live.
You're going to make that prediction.
I think he's going to end up going back. I don't think he can handle parenting from afar. I think it's starting to get to him. So. All right.
We'll
Thanks
see.
again for coming back on.
Good.
I'll have you back again.
See you later.
This episode of When Therapists Watch TV was produced by Ellie Mental Health. Miranda Barker is the managing producer. Jesse Stenbrotten is the technical director. Our production team also includes Julia Galloway, Lucas Mooney, and Tu Pham. A special thanks to Lucas Fellini, Nick Seeger, and Mel Springer. I'm Dr. Terri Bly. Thanks for listening.